and welcome to another edition of Mr. Zoller's Social Studies Podcast. I'd like to begin today by talking about the Christian medieval church, and we're going to start out with a quote. And this is a quote by King Alfred the Great, and he said this about medieval society. He said you could divide it up into three different parts. We're talking about men of prayer, men of war, and men of work. Now, today we're going to be talking about our men of prayer and the church that they make up here. Now, if you're talking about the Christian church, you need to remember that it is at the center of medieval society. We said nearly every manor is going to have a Christian church on it, but even more than that, at the center of your life in medieval times is the Christian church. From baptism at birth to marriages to funerals, your social life as well as your religious life is tied to the Christian church. Now, if we're talking about people, there's a term that I need you to know, and this term is called clergy, something called clergy. Now, I need to make sure that you grab a pencil, because you're definitely going to want to write this down. The term clergy simply means religious officials who work for the church. Now, I want to make sure that we understand. We're talking about religious officials here. So not the scribes or anything like that, but the people who are actually religious leaders. So I tell you what, why don't you pause while you write this down, and then unpause it when you're ready to go. All right. Now, let's start to talk a little bit about these religious officials and figure out who they are and how they fit into the hierarchy of the Christian church. When you see that word hierarchy, we're talking about the different levels that people are going to make up. So we've got our hierarchy that's on our notebook page. So I want you to, once again, you're going to want to write this down because this is definitely a main idea. I want to start out at the top. At the top of the hierarchy of the Christian church is the Pope. Now, the Pope holds supreme authority over the church. He makes the religious decisions as well as the political decisions. He's in charge. He's at the very top. Now, I tell you what, if we jump all the way then down to the bottom, at the very bottom we have our parish priests. Our parish priests oversee, you see this word over here, a parish. So that's just going to be like one individual church. Maybe they're the religious leader over one particular manor or one particular town. They conduct church services and supervise that religious instruction. If we work our way up this chart then, the next group that we would come to would be the bishops. Now, the bishops manage over a group of parishes. Remember that parish. The parish is the individual unit. The bishops manage a group of parishes, and this is called a diocese. Actually, in the early days of feudal society, this bishop over here, he's probably a feudal lord in and of himself. But they oversee all the local parish priests. Above our bishops, then, come our archbishops. And so we notice we've got this little prefix over here. The archbishops oversee a group of bishops. If a bishop oversees a group of parishes called a diocese, then the archbishop over here, he oversees a group of dioceses called an archdiocese. So he has control over this group of bishops in his area. That leaves only one group left, right below the Pope. And indeed, these are the advisors of the Pope. They're called the cardinals. They're sometimes referred to as the Curia or the College of Cardinals. They're going to advise the Pope. They're going to provide spiritual advice, political advice, legal advice, and indeed, they're going to choose the Pope once the Pope dies and they're in need of selecting an additional Pope. That's our hierarchy as it's set up here. Now, there's something that I want to note about the church that's very different from the rest of society here. In the church society, you are able to be promoted and work up these levels as we go. That's very different from political society. If you are the lord of a manor, then your son is going to be the lord of a manor. If you are a peasant living on that manor, guess what? You have no hope of someday becoming a lord. Very different situation here when we're talking about the church. So there's a think question I want you to answer, and it says, well, why might working for the church have appealed to people not of noble birth? And it's because they have an opportunity for advancement. So if we take our parish priest over here, and here he is, I'm moving him around. If he does a good job, there's a possibility that he might be appointed to become a bishop someday. And that bishop might someday work their way up to archbishop. And maybe, if they've got the right connections and maybe a little luck on their side, they might someday make it into the College of Cardinals. And if that happens, who knows, maybe someday that person is going to work their way up into the Pope. So we've got a kind of a merit-based system, one where you have an opportunity to advance, which is very different than some of our other parts of society that we see during feudal times. I want to switch gears now, and I want to talk about the powers of the church. Because you need to understand that when we're talking about some of our citizens here, they look at that church as their central guiding force. And they believe that they're spending just a little bit of time here on earth, and then someday only a few of them are actually going to make their way up into heaven. And so the power to either condemn people or to forgive sinners makes the church really a considerable force in medieval society. So many people entered into the clergy because they had these deeply held beliefs, but we've also got a lot of political power that they can exercise as well. And you notice that we've got our powers of the church over here. And there's one in particular that I want to emphasize to you, and that's this idea of excommunication over here. Excommunication means not allowing someone to be a member of the church. Now, because the Christian church was central to medieval life, this is really like throwing them out of the church. Maybe there's a visual I want you to think of that maybe is going to help you. If you're thinking about throwing somebody out of the church, the way I think of this is we've got our umpire over here, and he's going to say, "You're out of the church." Why is this a big deal? If you drive around town, you'll see an Episcopal church, a Presbyterian church, a Catholic church, a Baptist church. It goes on and on, right? You don't see that in feudal society at this time. Remember, there is only one church. If it's central to your life, if it is your social as well as your religious center, then if you are removed from that, that's a big deal. And so that punishment would be given to a group who commit the crime of heresy. And this is the last box that we need to fill in on this page. Here's what heresy is. Heresy is a crime. Heresy is denying or not believing in the teachings of the church. If you commit heresy and are found guilty of this crime, that's when you might be excommunicated, which would have been a terrible, terrible, terrible punishment during this time period here. So why don't you pause, make sure you've got that, unpause it when you're ready to go. All right. I'd like to finish today by talking about our essential question. Our essential question is, how was the medieval church structured, and how did the church influence medieval life? Well, there are a couple things that we can think about in trying to answer that question. First of all, in terms of the structure of the church, remember we outlined the 5 levels of that hierarchy. And remember, we said these are levels. When we mean hierarchy, we mean each one is on top of the other. So the Pope is on the top. At the very bottom, we've got our parish priests. These guys are still very important. There are a lot of these parish priests, and they're the ones who interact with most of the people. But in terms of the decision-making power of the church, which was very, very great, remember, the church is the one thing that ties all of Europe together during this time. The Pope really is in the supreme point of power here. The other part of the question, in terms of how does it influence daily life, I want you to think about a couple things. I want you to think about how we said it is very central, speaking of the church to life, how you've got that church that's at the center of all these feudal manors that exist there. And then the other thing maybe to consider would be the powers of the church. And that'll set you up for some discussions that we're going to have, and I think that'll help you answer this essential question. I hope you have enjoyed today's podcast. Continue to study the social studies, and I'll see you in class.